Yeah, okay. We just did migration right there. And I've been, if only it could be that fast. And I've been at Netflix about 4 years, right? So been there long enough. I've seen a lot of change. Trust me. I did a talk about change, and I tell people, when I started, Netflix was the rocket ship. At some point, we're compared to a Blockbuster. I'm like, I don't know what place I joined. So what are we talking about here? I like this little diagram, and we're talking about the life cycle innovation, right? So here we're talking about technology, and very simple 6 steps. You design, build, adopt, and then see those little red boxes: improve and maintain, migrate, and deprecate, right? And so let's pretend this is version X, your workforce, right? This is the system that you run. And then you have an idea, because the improve and maintain sucks. So you're like, okay, this is the time to finally solve the problem, right? And so what you do is you go to the second phase, which is sort of the design phase, right? And this is what I like to call V1, X plus 1 will solve all the problems, right? And the problem is that you'll get to design and build is exciting, and then you're gonna run into the problem of adopt, right? This is where it stalls. And why it stalls is because this part of the version X, the migrate part, is the hardest part, right? There's a lot of reasons for it, but this is kind of where the migration trap happens. And here's all the things, right? So first, you got to think about this on a time scale, right? It's a race against time. The longer your migration takes, the worse it's going to get, and the worse it's going to be for you, right? And so you really got to think about time scale. I like to tell people, we always talk about scale in number of requests and number of people handled and all that good stuff, but no one ever talks about scale on the time scale. Right? You take any great technology and you add 10 years to it, it's gonna suck, right? Like, that's just the reality of technology. And yet we don't think about it as engineering leaders, how we think about time on the time scale, right? And so here's what happens with time, and this is where the trap happens. 1, the leaders change, right? So I like to tell people, I was on a 6.5-year migration of API from our Gen 2 to Gen 3. I was the 5th leader to join, all right, 5th. When we finished it, I linked in all 4 of them and be like, I did it. I didn't even do it. It's so funny. I tell 6.5 years, it's still not done. So technically it's 7.5 years, still going. So leaders change, right? The person who actually came up with the idea is not even at the company anymore, right? So we're the leftover people to finish the migration, right? The next is teams change, The bigger you are, you're gonna probably have reorgs, you're gonna have new VPs, you're gonna have new leaders. As you've probably seen, Netflix has a new CTO, a CPO. A lot of changes have happened since I've been there, right? I've had a very different reporting change in the last 4 years. And guess what happens when team change? I didn't even put this on the slide, but when a team change, they'll look at V2 and be like, man, that sucks. I think I have V3, right? Don't do that. Anyways, another is business and priorities change. This is as simple as that. You might have built this technology with a certain thing in mind, and then what ends up happening is you blow up the whole thing, right? Everything you optimize for has changed in the business, right? So how do you deal with that, right? And this is the problem with the race against time, is as these changes happen, there's more likely to get into this trap, which then you can start getting abandonment, creation of additional versions, and then now you're in perpetual migration hell. Technology change. I'll tell people, Netflix invented a graph API. So one of the teams I lead is APIs. And we invented a graph language called Falcor. How many people have heard of Falcor? Oh my God, that's amazing. I didn't when I interviewed. I'm like, what the hell is Falcor? Well, Falcor actually was invented, I think, a month before GraphQL. It was our internal open source project on how you deliver basically a graph API with none of the coolness of GraphQL, right? And technology changed. So you bet this huge thing on this internally built technology, and then you know what? GraphQL starts getting adoption, it gets traction, it builds a community, and all of a sudden it's the hottest thing since sliced bread, right? The last, it might not work. I'm gonna kind of break it down for you. That amazing tech that you found that will solve all the problems, what if you're wrong? No, I'm not kidding. What if you're wrong? What if your engineer's wrong? What if the business is wrong? Like, I don't think people account for the fact that it might not work, right? So this goes back to like, how does Netflix try, quote unquote, try to avoid this problem? So I kind of laid out what I consider principles to successful migration. I mean, I added successful later, but I'm like, I gotta make it somewhat optimistic. So I kind of look at three big areas, right? One is plan and fund. You get what you pay for with a migration. You have a giant migration, you got one person on it, that's not gonna go well. I'm gonna tell you that right now, right? The second is prove significant value. You should approach migrations and technologies like a startup, right? When I did a startup, what am I trying to do? Break assumptions and prove or disprove the assumption, right? It's lean startup 101. Everything you think you're gonna build in that startup, you're gonna be wrong, right? And so the second most important principle is you gotta prove, and I put significant value and I'll explain why. And so it better be worth the effort, right? Usually the bigger the bet, the bigger the technology, the more the effort. And so that value better be really worth it. And the last, and I think most important, just like being a leader or engineer, you have to come in with a learning mindset, right? Pragmatic, not dogmatic. The number one problem that I've seen with failures on migrations is a dogmatic team. You got to do this because of this, right? You got to move because I told you. You got to move because I heard Netflix wrote a blog about it, right? Like that is not a reason. You know, you got to really think about what is it, how does it fit into your system? All right. So I'll start with one, the plan and fund. The failure mode of the problem is you will underestimate everything. One of our E7s who just did a massive encoding migration of 5 years, right? I'm like, oh, only 5 years? Dude, that's easy. He said this. He's like, you will underestimate everything. How long it's going to take, how long it's going to get buy-in, you know, all the different systems. It would just be wrong. So this is the problem. You come in with a migration, you pitch it to your leader, you're like, oh, it's going to take a year. No, it's not. It's going to take more than that, right? And so how do you deal with this idea of like, you're going to underestimate everything. You're just going to have to realize that that is a fact when it comes to migrations, right? So some ideas, focused effort and or teams. I know this seems really basic, that you should have a focused effort for migrations, but I found many strategies, including my own around why we need to build a federated GraphQL API, doesn't really account for the migration tax or how long it takes or the people needed to do the actual migration, right? So having focused teams to actually do the migration, to actually help move the systems from one place to another is super important. Second, use completion dates strategically, all right? Now, this is a big debate internally. So I wrote a blog internally at Netflix about this problem. And there's a big debate about when to use dates. Should you use dates? Not. When you use dates, everything happens. Maybe. The problem with using a date, if you're wrong, you're going to look bad. And so how do you use dates strategically? So an example is set a date for when you're going to get the first customer adopted, right? So set the date for the tactical items, not for the strategic. If someone's going to tell you, I'm going to finish the migration for sure in 2 years, I think they're just lying to you, especially if you're early on, right? Have a plan for the old system. Yeah, by the way, when you move to the new thing, the old thing's still running. And what are you going to do with it, right? How are you going to deal with it? Now, I say, hey, 100%, let's aim for deletion. Not going to happen. Netflix has millions of devices out there over 10, 15 years, right? We have a lot of complexity. It's very hard. And so you have to deal with it. You have to have a plan for the old system. What are you going to do with the old system? If you can't delete it, which is likely you won't be able to get rid of it, what are you going to do with it? All right. The second is prove significant value. There's a book called 7 Powers. And one of the powers of a business is the switching cost. So you have to understand this. Switching cost is a business advantage. Okay, what does that mean? That means when you have an existing system that does well, what I call the workhorse, switching over it is actually a competitive advantage, which means you need to understand that moving off of it is going to be very, very hard. And so if you can't prove significant value, it's not going to happen, right? And you think about as a startup, This is the biggest problem you're going to deal with as a startup, right? You come in, try to sell a company, 10% improvement is not going to get it done, right? If you're going to convince someone to move off of SAP or something, it better be 100x, right? And so that's the thing, right? You got to think about switching costs is actually an advantage, right? We don't look at it that way. And I think this is why you need to prove significant value. What I tell people is the new system better do something that the old cannot do. If it's just 10% better, it's not going to be worth the cost, right? And so items in here, build credibility through dogfooding. What's really funny is I've seen these migrations happen where the team asking for the migration hasn't done the migration themselves. I'm like, that seems kind of weird. Why am I doing this first? Right? And once again, some of these things might seem really basic. Like you're like, Bruce, you're telling me very basic. Yeah, it's actually that basic. And yet not many teams follow this, right? So depending on the technology, are you actually doing, right? So that's one. Tackle the hardest use case early. I didn't say first because you're probably gonna have to build some prototypes and get some users. But this is probably one of the hardest learned lessons we had. When we migrated from V2 to V3 API, our system, we left the hardest canvas last, right? So with Netflix Experience, the hardest canvas is the Lolomo or the homepage. Lolomo is not that fancy, it's a list of movies, right? And we left it last because it's the most complicated, has the most innovation, it's the hardest. And guess what? It was the hardest. And this is where a lot of the things that we thought the new thing could do well could not do it, could not handle the homepage, could not handle the scale, could not handle the complexity. And all of a sudden we found all these new use cases that we didn't realize. So when we did the migration from V3 to V4, which is from FileCore to GraphQL, the mobile team actually picked homepage first. And that was super scary. Everyone's like, why are we moving the hardest thing first? But the hardest thing is gonna give you so much lesson and honestly will prove the value. Because if you can't do it the hardest thing, what's the point? White glove early adopters, right? This is another tactic, is that switching costs, as you know, is gonna be very hard. So how do you white glove the adopters? A lot of people think, the team building the technology thinks, if I build it, they will come. No, they won't. No, they won't. You think they will come, but they won't. They will not necessarily do it and consume it the way you think, right? So you gotta really think about, how do I do what's not scalable? Another lesson from Lean Startup is early on when you're building a startup, do what's not scalable. Yes, if you're gonna do a multi-hundred service migration, eventually it's gonna have to be automated. But the early on, you're gonna have to do a white glove and you're gonna have to learn, right? And so when we were building the GraphQL API, one of our API teams, I had them actually do the actual migration from the previous API for the UI team, right? So that's an example of how do you actually get the momentum by doing the work for them. And the last is don't aim for feature parity. This goes back to, is it incrementally better, 10% better? Then you're probably not really going after the right technology, right? For us, GraphQL was a fundamental shift in how we build APIs at Netflix, right? So that's a pretty big shift. And so it is offering advantages that literally we cannot do, right? So number one is we didn't provide a single API. We had multiple APIs per device. So you had an iOS API, Android API, TV API, and a web API. So a fundamental change is the way we design and build the APIs that the old system just cannot do, right? And so that's an example of don't aim for feature parity. It's not gonna be as good in all the little places, right? All right, so last, this is the learning mindset, right? Challenge your own assumptions. So we talked about this. As the migrating team, there's that excitement. There's the, oh, this will solve all the problems. This is gonna be amazing. Look at all this debt I have to deal with, and oh, this is painful. But challenge your assumptions. Is it really gonna be better? You know, it's funny, we're in a multi-year migration, just so you know, with GraphQL. And I wake up sometimes in cold sweats wondering, what if I'm just wrong? What if everything I wrote in this memo about the future vision of APIs is just freaking wrong? Like it doesn't do what I think it does, right? And so that's the question. You gotta come in with a migration of that learning mindset. What are you trying to get from this? Are you absolutely 100% sure it does everything you just said? So what do? Focus on where your tech doesn't work. This is what I call skeptics to enthusiasts. I used to call it adversaries to advocates, but it's very negative connotation. But embrace your skeptics. Once again, with a startup, you know how they tell you when you do a startup idea, don't ask your friends and family. Ask someone who will challenge you, who will push your assumptions. Right? So you write a memo and you get that one person who complains and writes all the comments. You're like, oh my God, can this guy stop commenting on my doc? You should embrace that person. You got to figure out, where is it broken? What are they actually saying? Don't look at it like they're trying to ruin your idea. That's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to challenge your assumptions. And I'm not saying you got to solve all the problems before all your skeptics are addressed. That's not possible either. What I'm saying is, listen. Listen to the skeptics. Bet heavily on docs, testing, observability, DevX. So this goes back to, are you going to make it easy to do the migration? Right? Are you going to make it simple? How are you going to learn from all these things that you find from the early adopters and put it into documentation that people can absorb and consume? Right? So you got to think about the usability. Right? I mentioned the hardest part of your migration is migrating from the old system. It's the clients from your old system. So when the clients move to your new system, it better be well documented and maybe even have tooling and automated. It should be easy. Right? Last, and this goes back to it doesn't work, is abandoning the new tech and strategy is not a failure. I think this is where sunk cost fallacy really comes in, right? Is you put a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. It's gonna work. The 5th year, it's the year, man. It may not just be the right thing. I mentioned earlier, technology change, business change, priorities change. What happens if you're going down a migration path that no longer makes sense? And can you call it as a leader? And I think that's the courageousness that we have to have as leaders sometimes, is that you have to really think about, you just spent 2 years getting alignment to move to this new thing, and then you're gonna have to say, we can't do it. Right now, this is obviously not to be taken lightly. I'm not saying you should just abandon. You have a strategy, you believe it, you gotta push it, right? But abandonment of the strategy is not necessarily failure. It could be a learning. And we've seen cases where a failed strategy then led to a better outcome for the next time around. Right. All right, so I'm sorry, I just tricked you all. This whole talk was really about architectural tech debt, right? I try to do a talk about tech debt without actually saying the word tech debt, but that's what it's about, right? And I heard the previous speaker talk about how do you celebrate, how do you delete, how do you deprecate. So this is what I want to leave you with. High-performing software teams and engineers shouldn't just be measured by the number of systems they create, but by the migrations they finish and the systems they deprecate. So what I'm trying to push you here is that's what makes engineering excellent, right? If you really think about your top, really senior engineers, what are they really good at? It's not launching a new service that has 10 users and scale out to 100, 1,000, million. It's what they do with that system when they have to get rid of it, when they still have 100,000 RPS to it. What are you gonna do? How are you gonna migrate? The complexity of that problem. And what I noticed that even at Netflix, the most complicated migrations always had a very, very, very senior engineer attached to it, right? And I found that was super fascinating, because when I talked to each and every one of them, they were like, oh, well, no one appreciates this work. I just do it for fun. And I'm looking at them like, you're all like super senior. And we introduced levels recently, and I'm like, you're all E7s, which is the highest level at Netflix. It's like, yeah, but that's not because of it. I'm like, I'm pretty sure it's because you're really good at this. It's like, no one cares about that. No one cares about getting a system to run for a long time and be able to get rid of it. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure people care about this skill, because this is what the skill is. When you get more and more experienced, that excellence is about how you can finish and complete a successful migration. It's not about launching, right? And so I want to leave that with you all, is how you deal with tech debt, how you build into your systems, how you build it into your ethos is ultimately the success and how a high-performing team should be measured. All right, that leaves us 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bruce. That was an amazing talk. Yeah, a couple takeaways that I really liked were the focus on making sure there's like a dedicated, component to it, because I just see so many times those that just end up sitting if they don't, and it never ends up finishing. That's how you get to the 500 migrations ongoing part.
Exactly.
And there was one other thing, but I'm drawing a blank. So I will go to questions. Let's see. Let's highlight the first one here. Oh, and so if you want to ask a question, use the QR code in Slido. And we'll go to the first one, Bruce.
I love this question.
How do you keep engineers motivated while working on a migration rather than working on some shiny features or product?
Yeah, no, this is a huge problem. And actually, just so you know, I created a channel in Netflix called Tech Debt as Innovation. What I was arguing is that the tech debt we have and the complexity of tech debt is where there's a lot of innovation to be had. We don't look at it as innovation. Because when we say innovation, we always assume launching new features. That's not necessarily true, right? And how you deal with the system and how you move it from one place to another and how we tackle device retirement required innovation, thinking, and forethought, right? And so to me, it's about the positioning. I remember the last part I talked about. Even the highest level engineers in Netflix didn't value the work they did. That seems like pretty weird to me. And that's the problem, right? We don't talk about it. We don't celebrate it. We don't make it part of the criteria for getting promoted. And we're going to push for that, right? So I think this goes back to, as a leader, if you're here and you're an engineering leader, are you inadvertently making it more attractive to launch than to deal with old systems, right? How are you thinking about that, right? And I think, and I'm not saying, we all want to work on shiny new objects. I'm not saying that's bad. It's just this balance, right? You need to balance it. And I think we as an industry can do so much more in shining a light on the complexity of migrations, and that it's okay. I told you right before, I did a talk for Apollo GraphQL, and I gave them the number one criteria I have is I'm not going to be just pitching GraphQL. I'm going to talk about how hard it was to move to it and still moving to it, right? And that's to break the stigma.
Yeah.
This is where the hard stuff is. This is where the complexity is. This is where the senior folks play, right? And so I think it's a little bit of positioning. And, you got to sell it and you got to be able to promote it. You got to be able to talk about it. We put it in our engineering plan for a 1,000-person org. We put one of the top 5 items as intentional retirement mechanisms. How do we think about retirement intentionally? So you have to also build leadership buy-in for this stuff.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Yeah, it seems like you kind of make sure the incentives align.
Exactly.
To that. Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, look, that's the reality of society, right? You might be creating incentives you don't realize.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And like when we introduce levels, the number one worry is that the moment you add levels, you're going to create perverse incentives. All of a sudden, it's got new technologies that they can launch. And you see it happening actually. And so you notice that the moment you introduce these things, people will move to it whether you want it or not.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, let's move to the next one here. We have, what are the signals you look for as a leader when deciding whether to abandon a migration? How do you get buy-in and communicate the decision?
Oh, man, this is hard. I haven't done it yet, just so you know. It's like, I'm like telling people, you should do this. Like, I haven't done it yet. It's very hard. I think how I view this is that if you can, I think how I would do it, it's like, how would I do this? I think how you would do it is you step out. That's actually what I did, is the moment that I stopped running. So when I joined Netflix, I ran the API systems team. And through some reorgs, I run more teams now. So I run API, product telemetry, and TLI, which is a new team I created to deal with debt. And so the moment I stepped out of API is my baby and this is my world to I have other concerns, that's when you start really thinking about objectively where the problems are, right? So I have a leader who is, the GraphQL leader for our team, managing a stunning team of API engineers. But I continue to push on her. It's like, here's where the hotspots are. Here's what I'm hearing, problems. Here's where ICs are coming to me complaining. You gotta be watching out for these things. And so I think as a leader, you need to step away from the migration. The problem is the technology gets embedded with you. This is actually a problem with me when I shifted my leadership and I hired leaders. Mm-hmm. People still came to me because I'm the API engineer. I wrote some of these memos that set the strategy. So everyone came to me. I'm like, I don't run really that team anymore. You should talk to my managers. And I think if you can step out and really think more objectively of where the problems are, I think then you can make the call. Yeah. Right? And it's never that easy. I'm not saying you would just abandon the project completely, but you might say, hey, this tactic is not working. Maybe we should not do this thing we thought was a good idea.
Yeah, that definitely. Yeah, I think it, to relate it back to some of the points in your talk, it probably comes down to the pragmatic versus dogmatic aspect. Mm-hmm. I mean, at some point, are you just in it and you're just, like sunk cost fallacy type thing, and versus like looking at a high level, seeing is it actually providing the value we want. Cool. Let's see. All right, let's go to the next one. How do you deal with the dilemma of maximizing value for new user versus migrating sorry. We'll keep with this one. One other started to get a lot of upvotes.
There was a here migration. I'm ready to answer that.
Yeah. Okay.
I got a whole list.
All right, let's go to that one. Okay. All right, sure. We'll go back to
I was trying to avoid the hard part. No, let's start with this one.
Versus migrating.
Yeah. So like maximizing value for new user and migrating for existing user. This is a tricky thing. I mean, it depends on what the migration or technology is, right? Like I mentioned earlier, sometimes the new tech is fundamentally different than what the old tech did. Right. So even in the API, it's like, yes, they both have the words API in it, but they're fundamentally different technology. Right. And so I think that's the first thing is like, if it's a fundamentally different technology, what you're trying to is build that enthusiasm so people will want to migrate. Okay, this is the key. You want people to want to migrate, not because you told them. I know this sounds simple, once again, but it's not. It is not.
Oh, yeah.
It's very hard to actually get people to want it. And so how I approach it is if there is a technology you really want, that's why you go after the hard stuff. That's why you go after the creaky wheel. Because at some point, you're going to hit that inflection point where the new tech is superior. Actually, it's so good that people don't even want to use the proper mechanism. So I'll give you an example. On the studio side, which is where our federated graphical architecture started, it created one of the most complicated graphs because it represents our content production systems. And it was the only place at Netflix where you can get all the information about all of our studio business. So backend jobs started using it. Backends, I'm like, dude, this is not what graphical is designed for. But the problem is it was so good at its job, it became a single source of truth that wasn't available. So that's an example of, it's not about the maximum value, it's about those extraordinary, unique things the thing can do that makes people want to move. But you have to remember, the old system has that too. So in some cases, the old system's just really good at doing that one thing, and you're just gonna have to deal with it. And this is where it goes back to, maybe you don't delete the old thing. And by the way, my APIs, I can't delete them. It's powering the old legacy devices.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have to run them for another 10 years, right? I'm not kidding. Like, it's literally going to be 10 years.
Till the 10th leader, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah. So one of you will be in this room. Gets up in 10 years. Like, I heard Bruce talk now.
Yeah, cool. That makes a lot of sense. Let's go to the one that you said was difficult. We'll end with this one. So 7+ years for migration is long. Can you please share examples of the tactical approach you took to ensure progress was made?
Yeah. I'll give you a very tactile approach, and I'll tell you what happened. So when we moved from V2, so V2 was API.next. It was a very complicated, like, basically effectively development platform that any engineer could build, Groovy scripts on top of this like managed Java runtime, right? Pre kind of containerization. So that was V2, right? And we're trying to move to what we call Edge Pass, which is a containerized version where UI teams could build, no Quark or no JS, server, BFS, backends for front ends, that can connect to a backend layer that's connected via the DNA API, which is the Falcor API, right? So it's like, those two systems were what we were migrating. Now, the problem is, the dirty little secret is it was just all in a monolith. Because when DNA first started, the idea was to create a new API. But the problem is the secret sauce of .next was the service layer. It was the only place in Netflix that represented the discovery domain model. So think about it. You microservices, 200 services and libraries. We don't have a database that you can query and be like, give me all the images. Well, it depends on who the user is and the profile and where you're located, right? And what show can you actually watch? And so the problem is that was the magic. And so when every team trying to move to new technology didn't recognize that that was the magic, they were doomed to fail. Because what happens is they try to replicate the service layer and it's impossible. It does so much. It's literally powers the Netflix experience, right? And so what we did is we knew that. We knew that going in and we made a bet. Number one thing, GraphQL cannot be on the monolith. We cannot have another generation of APIs in the monolith, right? Because the previous generation had to be, because the moment we discovered that it was impossible to migrate the service layer, we said, okay, just put the new API on top. And we actually almost went down this path, by the way. Early on in the GraphQL adoption, the easiest thing was to build it in a monolith because it can tap all the magic.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So what we did is, this is the thing. What is the thing your thing does really, really well? And we went after that hard and we pulled it out. And that was a 2-year plus migration before technically GraphQL actually took hold. So we had a prototype that was running and people were using it. That was not built, that was not the right architecture, by the way. But we had engineers focused on, we got to pull out the monolith. We got to pull out the service layer. We created a strategy called UST, or Uniform Service Tier. And instead of a Java layer, we created a proto layer. And it was basically a well-defined proto API that represented the Netflix experience internally, not the GraphQL API, but the internal API. And that was the bet. We got to build UST. We got to pull it out. And so when the graph, because we knew we're going to have to run DNA for years and years and years. So if we can get DNA to talk to UST and we can get GraphQL to talk to UST, we've now decoupled it from the monolith. And that was the most dangerous thing for us, is that we can't put another migration on the monolith. So that's an example. What's a tactical strategy is that you may need to create a bridge solution, right? To get to A to B technology, right? And you got to find out what that magic sauce of your A is. See, this is the problem. When you build B, you forget what A did. You forgot how good it is at its job. And I think that as a leaders, don't have hubris on this thing. That thing is really good at what it does. Let's just admit it. And so what is it really good at, and can we pull it out, right? And so for us, that was creation of UST, pulling out the service layer. And that unlocked all sorts of innovation. And that's actually where I came up with the term tech debt as innovation. So we took this super complicated piece of debt, this monolith that housed 15 years and 5 generation APIs. We completely decomposed it, right? And so that's what was exciting.
Got it. Cool. Thank you, Bruce. Really appreciate this. We are a little over time, so just one quick question I'm doing to all speakers. So what is...
Good, I listened in before, so I know what you're asking.
Yes. What is one book that you would recommend to the audience that you feel changed the way you work or live your life?
It's like the Live the Life. That was the truth. And actually, this is a Live the Life. It's called Give and Take by Adam Grant. So anything by Adam Grant is great. We talked about earlier, Simon Sinek, Adam Grant, right? And Daniel Pink are the great writers of our day. Give and Take really changed my mindset, because I think the idea before, for most people, if people haven't read it, is that takers, people who take advantage of people who, are in it for themselves, win. Right? That's the common understanding in the industry. If you're like a super selfish CEO, that's how you get to the top. And unfortunately, that's the kind of leaders you see who is always promoting themselves, right? Because they're narcissistic. And I think what Adam Grant broke down is like, no, that's actually not true. You actually want the givers, the people who help and give and mentor. And I think that book really changed me, because it's sort of like, hey, maybe I'm okay to be a giving type of leader. I don't have to take, I don't have to be ruthless. I really care about accountability and delivering, so I'm ruthless in that way, but I don't have to do it in a negative. And I think that book really gave you that permission, and it's also why I mentor and why I'm part of the Plato community. And there's a word in it, it talks about being otherish, which is you're for other people, but you're also a little selfish. So the idea is that you can't be selfless, because then you're just going to burn yourself out. But you should be otherish, right? Which is you care about others, but you also worry about protecting your time. And so I think I really take that and hold that. And I just constantly gives me a comfort to know, hey, I could do this right. I can lead teams right.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Love that, Bruce. Yeah, thank you so much for your lessons. We do have Bruce doing a breakout session at, it's 1:10, is it?
I think it's 1:00 at table 7.
Yeah, 1:00 at table 7. So feel free to see him in the mezzanine. And yeah, let's give it up for Bruce. Thank you so much.